Here goes. I'm going to do just a quick introduction for Mallory. I am thrilled that Mallory McDuff has joined us this evening. Mallory is a writer, a teacher, a mother, and a person of faith. Mallory teaches environmental education at Warren Wilson College in the Shenandoah Valley near Asheville, North Carolina. It is also where I went to college. She lives with her two daughters. She lives in a 900 square foot house. We'll hear more about that, with an expansive view of a white barn, a herd of cows, and the Appalachian Mountains. Can I come visit? My students inspire my writing as they integrate academics with community service and work on campus. Mallory is the author of the books Love Your Mother. This is her new book, by the way, which we're not really going to talk much about tonight, but I do want you to check it out. It is called Love Your Mother, 50 States, 50 Stories, and 50 Women United for Climate Justice. So it's a wonderful, wonderful topic. Tonight, we will be talking about our last best act, planning for the end of our lives to protect the people and places we love. And Neil is holding that up there. And I want to make sure that our sound is working. Mallory, will you say something?
Yes, I will.
Okay, I'm not here.
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear her, Neil? Great. Okay,
Okay.
that is me. I'm muted. That's what I've got going on here. Okay, perfect. I'm going to turn this over to Neil.
Great. Thank you, Roger. Now I can't hear.
Oh, now we can't hear you, Mallory. I mean, Warren Wilson's in the mountains, but it's not that far in the mountains. Good Lord. I wonder if it's the headphones. Now you're muted. Oh, no. Y'all, we're going to get this.
Without the headphones.
There we
Okay,
go.
I can hear you, but now I can't see your video because I think I accidentally stopped it. So let me fix that.
I think it was accidentally stopped.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, I'll start my video again.
This is all. Oh my God, now it works. All about grace here, people. I'm going to hop off and y'all get started. Have at it, Neil.
Thanks, Roger.
It's Lent. You know, we're exercising our discipline and
Exactly.
all of that stuff. Oh my gosh.
Well, it's so nice to meet you, and it's really an honor to have a conversation with you. And Roger's probably told you I'm from North Carolina as well, around the Winston-Salem region. So that's always fun too. To I didn't grow up in the mountains, but close enough to go to have lunch in and come back home if I wanted to. So in fact, but of course now I'm sitting here in Houston. In fact, I'm right across the street from Rice University. It's right across Main Street from where I'm sitting right now. But you have some connections to Rice University, is that right? Or
I do, yeah. My dad's family grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and actually they became Episcopalians, my dad's family, because his mom was Baptist, his dad was Catholic, and in Mississippi. Yeah. The Episcopalian was a nice meeting ground, but my dad was the oldest of 5 children, and he got into Rice. And at the time, if you got into Rice, you actually got free tuition. Right. So it was a really big deal. And my dad plays a big part in this book, and a big part of my journey to look for sustainable end of life options. But as a child, because he had very high expectations, but he also, we heard the story many times from his siblings, how he actually his parents came down with the other 4 kids for graduation, and he was a Navy ROTC, and he had actually failed out that semester. And, pre-cell phone, pre-phone, anyway, he had to wait and tell them when they drove up to campus. He got straight A's that next semester and graduated and went on. So he got a great education.
Did they come back for a second trip though? Did they come back the second time?
That's a good question. I think they did, but okay. Yeah, I think they did. But he was in the engineering school and just got a great education, and sure. It was a good thing as a child to know that he was not perfect.
Well, that's actually a great segue into. I mean, he seems like he must have been a real character, and So, if I understand it correctly, he not only had a lot of opinions, but a lot of very specific requests about what should be done after his death. Right? Is that, and I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what those were and how that made you feel, like at the
Yeah.
moment versus later, or.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Neil. And he had a lot of opinions about a lot of things. He was an IBM salesperson, but and my mom taught preschool, and we grew up in a town called Fairhope, Alabama. So it's right on the coast, across from Mobile Bay, across from Mobile, Alabama, and it's a beautiful place. And they were not like environmental activists that you think of. They were community members active in their Episcopal church. My dad sang in the choir, my mom was on the altar guild, but yet they hiked the Appalachian Trail, all 2,000 whatever miles of it. They hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. This is after we were grown. They hiked almost all of the Continental Divide Trail, and we grew up just really being in the outdoors was the equivalent of going to church. And we did both and spent a lot of time outdoors. And so growing up, he always would say, I don't want a funeral home to be involved in my funeral. I want it to be, I want family and friends to care for my body. He built, when I was in middle school, a little prototype of a pine casket. And it was the size, the palm of my hand, and my mom kept her jewelry in it growing up.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and so he, as a kid though, this was just background noise, to me at least. And it became very real when my mother was killed, when she was about my age. I'm 57, she was 58, and she was hit by a teen driver, and she died instantly. And they were coming from a Christian yoga practice to the community supported agriculture, the farm where they got their food, and my dad volunteered there in exchange for food. She was killed instantly. And right after her death, about a month after, my dad called I'm the oldest of four, called us home to Fairhope and read a 2-page directive with the explicit wishes for his death. And you can imagine that at the time I was in my 30s, I had young kids, and I wasn't really ready to plan his funeral. I mean, we had dealt with my mom's death, but what I did, we listened to everything he asked for, and we said, of course, we'll do all of this. But we thought his death would be years later, and it wasn't. He died in essentially a mirror image accident by another teen driver while he was biking to the community supported agriculture, the farm where he volunteered. And he broke his neck and died immediately, just like my mom. And in the shock of the congruence of their deaths, his directives really became this kind of marching orders that grounded us and gave us momentum. He was very clear that he wanted a pine casket. He didn't want to, we always knew he didn't want to be embalmed. Embalming is not required in any state in the country. And that's, a lot of people think it is, but it's not. He didn't want a concrete vault. And that is, a concrete box essentially that's often put in the ground, essentially to keep the landscaping level. So he was very specific about what he didn't want, and he was specific about what he did want. He wanted shovels by the grave site so young and old could put dirt on top of the grave. He wanted his bluegrass band playing. He even did like a playlist, which sounds like so extreme, like a lot of detail, but that detail was so freeing for us. We didn't have to think, what would he want at the graveside? He had told us.
Have you talked to people about the difference between having a roadmap, so to speak, versus having nothing at all? I mean, what that's like in I don't know what the words are to use. I mean, it's always stunning. I don't care if you anticipate a death. Once it happens, the finality of it is shocking on some level. And So there's a big difference between having nothing and having even an outline.
Yeah. Well, I have talked to a lot of people about it, and you're right, Neil, that it's freedom for the people who have to deal with not only their emotions, but also the finances, and the logistics. And I do in the year that I spent really exploring options for my own body, um, for a lot of people, we talked about the fact that, death really is about logistics.
Mhm.
I mean, that's when somebody dies, and that's the immediacy of all the logistical decisions that have to be made. They're overwhelming, and they're more overwhelming if you're kind of guessing what this person would want. And my parents, my research for this book came years after their death. I had, soon after their deaths, I was like, okay, I've got to get my final wishes in order. And everybody I knew was being cremated. I mean, cremation was in their final directives, and flame cremation. And so I did the same thing. And I'm a single mom teaching, as Roger knows, at a wonderful college, but it's not like Rice University. There aren't a lot of financial resources here. So the salaries are pretty flat, and finances and costs were a big factor for me. So I spent this year looking at all the options that were out there from a perspective of cost, as well as caring for creation. And I was really interested in the climate, and then community. What would be a decision that my community, which is my daughters, but also my friends, that they could get behind.
When you think about, how people deal with death or how they don't, it's interesting you mentioned that your dad had specifically mentioned the shovels, because I think back immediately to when I was a priest at Bruton Parish in Williamsburg, Virginia. Ashes could be buried in the historic churchyard there. And when we were done with the liturgy and we were standing out in the churchyard, I would pick up a shovel and offer it to members of the family to put a shovelful or two of dirt in the hole. And, there were a lot of times when no one would take the shovel. And so I would ask someone to hold my prayer book, and I would do it myself while they watched. And so we didn't leave and have it be finished. We finished it while we were out there. And that is a really, really powerful moment, and something that my brother and I actually got to do at our father's funeral. And I'm wondering, some people embrace that kind of invitation. Others just don't want to go anywhere near it. And some people don't even want to see that. But have you had conversations with people to encourage them to at least consider participating in moments like that? I mean, they don't happen very often. So once you've passed it by, it's not coming back.
Right. Yes. And I think that the more we can have experiences where family and friends are participating in, whether it's, whatever the method of disposition is, I think then that kind of normalizes it. And also, I think my dad got the idea for the shovels. It's interesting. It was from a burial at Sewanee. On my mom's side of the family, this is like I'm dropping the Episcopal names.
Right.
It's a small world in the South, at least. But on my mom's side of the family, her uncle was the dean of the seminary for years at Sewanee. I mean, this is years ago. But at his burial, which was at Sewanee, there were not just one but multiple shovels. And I think also having more than one shovel, I think it looks like, okay, there's work to do. It's and so that's where he got the idea. And I, as well, we'll talk probably later too, but I volunteered at a conservation cemetery.
I want to ask you about that later. Yeah.
So all of at those grave sites, there were multiple shovels. And it's for me, what was most powerful in the burials that I observed, as well as thinking about my father's burial, my oldest daughter, who's 24 now, was 4 years old. So my parents have been dead for over 20 years. Seeing those children pick up these shovels, my daughter doesn't really remember
right.
my my parents, but she remembers shoveling that dirt on the gravesite. I mean,
I
she
guess
remembers, kind of broad strokes, but
Right.
that it embodies that what you're losing, and that a body is going back to the earth.
Right, there's a connection to that moment, to what's being done.
Yeah.
You're not just an observer. And one of the things you mentioned earlier about you had mentioned embalming, for example, about what people do or don't know about their options. And I was thinking, it just so happens my father died 15 years ago today. And
Oh,
we
wow.
lived in Minnesota at the time, and I managed to get back to North Carolina in time to see his body before he was cremated, which for me was really important. And then I dealt with the funeral home about a few of the details after that. And I think about a couple of things. One was that finding a beautifully stained but plain wooden container for his ashes was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. But they did have one, amid sculptures of dolphins and all kinds of other things. They did have one. And then I went to the funeral home when they were putting his ashes in that container, because I wanted them to be put directly into it without a plastic bag or the metal bag in it. And I only knew to ask about that because I'm an Episcopal priest and I've actually handled ashes before. So how do you get people to have a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, so that they know what really happens with human remains and what you can choose or to do or not to do? I mean, a lot of people really don't know what their choices are.
No, I think, I was among that perspective, before I wrote this book. I mean, I had the experience with my parents' funerals and burials, so I probably, knew more about what you could do. For example, but there was so much I didn't know when I started this book. I thought I knew more than I did, which is classic, right? I'm a parent. But for example, I'll just give you the example of my dad's death. He was it was a hit and run accident, so we didn't even know where his body was.
Sure.
He had wanted he'd wanted what's called a home funeral. He'd wanted his body to be, in his bedroom and kept cool with dry ice. We couldn't do that because his body, it turns out, was at the coroner's office. And then they transferred his body to the local funeral home, who had dealt with him with my mom's death. So they knew that less was more for him. And we went and had a meeting the next day after convening in my hometown, and met with the funeral home director and said, "We don't need you to do anything. All we need you to do is to keep the body cool. We don't need you to prepare his body for burial. We don't need a casket," because my dad had asked a friend, if I can't build my own casket, will you do it? And he pulled an all-nighter and had a beautiful pine casket. But this felt revolutionary.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And so my sister and I were in the refrigerated room at the funeral home, and we picked up his body and put it in the pine casket and put it in a pickup truck.
Wow.
And drove it to the church for an overnight vigil. So I share that story because we have more agency than we know. Right. We do. And with if the choice is to deal with, there are funeral homes that are embracing more green options, but you have to also be careful because there are also some that are, greenwashing. Like, here's a $10,000 green casket. Like, right. you don't sure. need that. So the bottom line in the funeral industry, the line that you hear that I found to be true is, if you don't like the prices at one place, go across the street. Sure. And they make it cheaper, and less is generally more. So the services that are advertised, less is more. You don't need embalming. You don't need a vault, and it's easier to ask for what you want beforehand.
Yeah,
not necessarily prepaying, but like do some exploration. And like, for example, for flame cremation, some funeral homes will sell you a nice casket before they burn it.
Sure. Yeah.
you know, and all you really need is the cardboard box because it's going
Right.
to be insulated. But the one thing that's not, that's available in 26 of the 50 states now is called aquamation. So there's another
Oh.
form of cremation. There's flame cremation, which is what it's all I thought was out there. But there's another form of cremation called water cremation or aqua cremation, that burns less fossil fuels. It's essentially water and lye. It is, from what I've read, it's not yet available in Texas, but it is coming. All the funeral directors that I've talked to, say this is like the new. It's not new. It's been around for livestock and pets forever.
Well, I was going to
But
say, I have to confess that I only know about that process because of someone that I knew in secondary school, and he owns a business in North Carolina, does that for pets. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of it. And then only after hearing people talk to you did I know, am I remembering this correctly? That Bishop Desmond Tutu?
exactly, he's
I had
yes.
never heard that until people were having conversations with you about this. So that was that was news to me as well.
Well, and Desmond Tutu, folks that are in this, line of way of life, line of work, really say, Desmond Tutu, that decision, it was a public outreach. It was an educational decision because for many people, that was the first that they had heard of it. So it will be, I predict that it will be available, quite soon.
So, you mentioned some of those things you were dealing with a while back. Again, they seem so new and like you hadn't even heard of some of these things much before that. And really for most of my ordained ministry, and I would suspect for most of the people right now who are listening to our conversation tonight, that the only choice they've really known that they've had with respect to funerals is between burial and a casket or flame cremation, as you put it. But there are these other options. And I'm wondering if you could describe, you mentioned one, the water cremation. What other options are they? And do all of these other options, do they all fit under the umbrella of green burials?
No is the answer. There's some other options that are unique unto themselves. But it's just interesting, the example that comes to mind, for me is like, I remember traveling on an airplane when my oldest daughter was a baby. And I remember calling my mom and I'm like, I can't believe it. There's all these children, babies are flying. Like, and I had not,
Right.
and she said, you just haven't noticed them because it wasn't relevant to you. So I really thought about that a lot with this research, because once I started asking the questions, what's out there, I could not believe, particularly, in my home region here in Western North Carolina, but also across the country, there's so many more options besides just green burial and flame cremation. So some of those that I investigated were the human composting, which is a very new option, but it's now available in at least 6 states, and it's essentially, if you think about how we compost food waste by adding organic matter, and then we can add that to a garden bed. There's a machine where you basically, the body is entered into the machine, and organic materials are added, and over the course of a 30-day period, what emerges is rich compost. And it's a scientific process that's, if anybody wants to read about it, the company that started this is called Recompose, and it's based in Seattle. But it's really fascinating, particularly if you think about, it was started to take in consideration, urban areas that don't have a lot of green space for, green burial cemeteries or whatnot. So that's one of them. And, the other one I looked at was body farms. There's only 7 of those in the country, but one happens to be in Western North Carolina, where you can donate your body for the study of decomposition at a university. So that's kind of interesting, because a lot of my friends, particularly male friends, will say like, oh, I just want my body to go out into the woods and, become one with nature. And this is a body farm is a place you can actually for free donate your body. And then, it's researchers and students are studying decomposition. That research at a body farm was really pivotal for the development of the human composting too. So that's really interesting. But in terms of options that fall under green burial, and there are a couple that you can think about. And one is these conservation cemeteries. And that's where the land is protected in perpetuity by conservation easements, so legal protections. And people, you pay to be able to bury your body or ashes, that land is always protected. But the second option, and you have this option in Texas, is green or natural cemeteries that are called like hybrid cemeteries. So you can do conventional burial there, for example, with a vault, but you can also do green burial, which is defined as no vault, no embalming, and biodegradable materials. So, and there are several in Texas, and there's one outside of Austin, there's one outside of Dallas, that are certified by the Green Burial Council. And you can just Google green burial cemeteries, in Texas. But the last example that I want to share is that you can do a green burial by asking your local cemetery, can I bury without a vault?
Mm-hmm.
You can bury without embalming because it's not required anywhere. But some cemeteries in their contract require a vault. And what I ended up doing for a cemetery at Warren Wilson was spending time negotiating with the volunteers there about changing their contract. So now they don't require a vault, but they did, and it was just a relic really from the past.
Interesting. So so was that hard to do, or did they sort of see that this was going to be a new thing? And
well, it was a year-long process, really. The land Roger has been to this cemetery, I'm sure. The environmental studies is the most popular major at Warren Wilson.
okay,
So it's
I guess that makes sense. Yeah.
We've got a farm, we've got, a garden, we've got forest,
Right.
but we had this little cemetery and nobody really knew that it required vaults until I started, digging around with this,
That makes
research.
sense.
Yeah, well, it's owned by the Presbyterian Church. It's a tiny little, well, but it's funny. The guy who was most vested in the cemetery was an 85-year-old retired math teacher who mowed the cemetery. And he didn't want like a young thing like me telling him, which I'm not really young, but
the landscaping, right.
Yeah,
I have a question about this related to those last two examples, because I think sometimes people read news articles about green burial now and then, and they think that it's just brand new or something. And I immediately think of my Jewish colleague and friend whose congregation on the other side of Rice University, and Jewish burials happen quickly and without the extra literal stuff that many of us have often thought wasn't really optional. So, is that a form of green burial? It's actually a very old practice.
Right, and Muslims don't use embalming or vaults. So it's very important, the language, when people will say traditional burial.
Right.
Traditional burial is green burial. Conventional burial or modern burial practice is where the embalming and the vaults and whatnot, have become a practice.
I have a question. I think you have a chapter in your book about containers, and it makes me think of, I have this memory of someone's ashes being brought to a church that I worked at a long time ago, and it was in a biodegradable container. And it was the first time that I thought to myself, apparently everyone's not on the same page when discussing what that term means, because this particular container, it sure looked and felt like more like plastic than the cardboard boxes we usually use when burying ashes in the cemetery at that particular church. And I just kind of wondered in my mind, exactly how long is it going to take for this to degrade in the ground? And I'd never really thought about it before, quite frankly. It was just the fact that it was presented as this is biodegradable. So what does that even mean? And what are some different options for how we think about containing human remains?
Right. Well, biodegradable means if it can degrade. And generally those are materials like cotton, linen for a shroud, for example, because you don't have to be buried in a casket. You could be buried in a shroud, or pine, woods that aren't exotic woods, not metals. So if we just think about plastic, definitely
Right.
not, unless it's some form of, something haven't heard of, but yeah, well, yeah, but definitely when you just think about cardboard is biodegradable. So, what could you put in a compost pile in your backyard and it would degrade?
The other thing that, as an ordained minister, I think a lot about the words we say and the rituals we do at and after death, but I also think a lot about the places where we do all of those things. And having been raised in the Moravian church, in the Winston-Salem area, I love the sense of peacefulness that God's Acres, they call their cemeteries, that conveys with simple and equal flat headstones. So there's a sense of peacefulness when you walk through those spaces. And I'm curious about the place where you volunteered, where there's attention to the land and so forth. I would assume that there's that same sense of peacefulness conveyed in a different but analogous way.
Definitely. If you visit conservation burial grounds, and again, you can Google this and see examples. It looks like a park, So the one I've visited several just as a part of this research. The first one was actually in Georgia. There's one outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm sorry, the first one was in South Carolina. There's two now in North Carolina. There's one in the Piedmont that just started called Bluestem. And so it's like walking in a park. It's not manicured. You almost can miss the burial sites.
Right.
And you can have a flat headstone, but many people choose not to. And the landscape changes with the seasons. And if you want to come visit the area where a family member or friend is buried, you can call in advance, and they can locate it by GPS. And
that was going to be my next question: how they know where everybody's buried. Okay.
You whack a little path, but if you just take a walk through it, there's the ground is kind of raised a little bit, but then with the rain, the ground levels. So it's quite beautiful.
Interesting. I'm going to ask some questions from our people listening to this conversation in just a few minutes, and if you have a question, be sure to add it in the chat box. But one of the things I keep thinking back to this kind of general how we deal with things. One of the curious things that I've had to deal with more during the second half of my vocation than I did in the first half of my vocation is occasionally trying to persuade a family to have their loved ones' remains present at the actual funeral. In the first half of my vocation, I don't think that ever came up. And it sometimes feels like it's part of our American tendency to distance ourselves from death as far as possible. So, some people want a dead body removed as quickly as possible and to stay removed from them at a funeral home. Don't bring that into my home, even if what you're talking about is ashes in a container. And sometimes don't bring that to the very ceremony where I'm going to remember the life of this person. I'm just curious about that because it doesn't happen all the time, but it certainly does happen more often than it ever did, in years past. And for those who have fears like that, do you have stories that you've heard that might help them reconsider, how they think about those kinds of things?
Well, to me, and I'm a lay person in the Episcopal Church, obviously, but I have a lot of friends, including one of my best friends is Bishop Brian Cole, who's the Bishop of East Tennessee, and we've been friends for almost 25 years, and he continually pushes me to think about the church and death and life in relationship to the body. What
Right.
is, how are we embodying the Holy Spirit? How are we embodying God? How are we embodying Jesus? And this research for me was a way to realize that our relationship to the body, ourselves, and the bodies of those who have died, the closer we are to that, the closer we are to death and the immediacy of it. And that's can be hard, but it's also one of those things that just boggles, my mind as a mother, because as a mom, you've at least probably held a baby or two,
Right.
like before you have your own. But as a person, encountering death, many of us have never been anything close to that. And so I think it just, the more that we can normalize that, I think the better.
Let me ask you another question, because I've heard this come up when other people have talked to you as well. I thought about this actually this past week, because recently, for the first time in several years, I had the opportunity to catch a ride to the cemetery in a funeral home car. And as soon as that car door closed, has been true in my past experiences, the funeral director and I, we start talking to one another like we're just normal people, because a lot of other people don't view us as sort of normal. And so there's kind of a special relationship that can happen when you have those moments. And I'm curious, there are bad apples in both vocations, but there are a lot of us trying to help people as best we can, as best we know how to do that. And I'm wondering what has been your relationship with traditional funeral professionals, and has that changed in some way over time because of specific people that you met and gotten to know along the way, maybe as you're writing this book?
So you're saying like conventional funeral?
Yes, right.
I'm I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they definitely. And in the book, I reveal a scene where there's one funeral director who was a woman who was very helpful to me. She let me, shadow her in the funeral home. She invited me to attend a home funeral. And I had gone, this is early in my research, and I had really kind of gone into it with my dad was very anti-funeral home.
Mhm.
And I took some of those assumptions with me. And when she read the draft of what everybody who was in the book, I had them read the draft chapters, and she read an early draft and basically called me on some of my assumptions, specifically cost. I was comparing the low cost funeral home here, and there is one where you can get cremated by flame cremation for $900, and she worked at more of a higher end one. And she called me on the assumptions of being paid a fair wage, a living wage, some of the things that it was good for me to be called out on.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, right. That's a good point. Do you think that some of these options that you've been talking about, are those going to be increasingly offered through traditional funeral homes in addition to being offered outside of them? Do you think that's going to grow and expand?
It already is. Yeah. And, there's like, for example, I've collaborated in a presentation with a funeral home that isn't a conventional funeral home, but it's a new one called the Natural Funeral. And they're in Colorado, and they offer green burial, human composting, and aquamation. So that's an example of like a standalone new funeral home. In Asheville, I interviewed folks at Gross Funeral Home. They're a conventional funeral home, but they are collaborating with the conservation cemetery, and basically giving like reduced prices for folks who are getting buried there, as a way to collaborate with the conservation burial ground. So I see that as growing. And that's a way.
Here's a question. This is a good question. We were talking earlier about, I guess, flame cremation versus the growing trend of water cremation. And someone wants to know when you're doing the latter option, if you choose the latter option, what is it that what remains at the end of that process? What do you get back?
Yeah, that's a great question. The outputs or the remains from aquamation look very similar to the remains from flame cremation. Okay. Essentially, what we call ashes are crushed bones. Mm-hmm. And there's a machine that they put the bones in and they crush them up. And I think, we want to think that they're just the ashes from the burning of the body, but primarily the body's water and the water evaporates. And so what we get is primarily crushed bones, and that's the same in aquamation. The liquid is actually can be poured down the drain
Okay.
From the water in the lye. So you get a similar product.
Is it, I think a lot of people are surprised if a lot of people don't want to go near them, but traditional, ashes from flame cremation, I think some people are surprised by how much there is and how heavy it is. And
Yeah.
from what their imagination might, is that the same of the other process, or is it way different?
I haven't personally seen but I've seen videos and talks with funeral directors about it. But it's essentially the same bones that are being crushed. They're used as a similar machine. There's a name for the machine. I can't remember it.
Okay.
But yeah, it is similar.
Someone else has a question about end of life doulas, which I think a lot of people listening to this may not have heard of, and I'm curious kind of how that relates to hospice care, which most people, either they're aware of it, they've either embraced it, or they at least know about it. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, there is a chapter in my book about end of life doulas or death doulas, and I interviewed a lot of end of life doulas as a part of this, and then participated in some home funerals where they were present. But to me, if you can think about if you are giving, again, I use the birth analogy, but if you're giving birth to a baby, you might have a doctor, but many people also hire a birth doula who's not a medically trained professional, but they are somebody who is there to support the mother, to support the family, sometimes help with nursing, etc. So analogously, with death, if you have, as you're dying, you may have, hospice comes in and they are medically trained, right? And so, but many people also ask for the services of a death doula or end of life doula who provides logistical support, emotional support for the family, sometimes in the dying process. And then there are also death doulas who specialize in, after death. If you wanted to have, for example, a home funeral, but it's so that's kind of how how I think about it. And some death doulas, they charge a fee for their services, and it's kind of all over the map in terms of what people charge. Some are volunteer, so it's just, again, you can usually Google it and find services in your area.
Well, in the same way that a lot of people may not have heard about that before, there's a really interesting question, kind of wrestling with that dilemma in another category, and that's that some people, when they're thinking about their own wishes for their death or after their death, they may not know about all the half the things we've just talked about. So so they die, but then there are other family members who are trying to make decisions after they've died. Maybe they do know about some of these things. How do people struggle with that? The intentions as best they can for someone who's died, but again, maybe that person didn't even know about a few of these other options, and respecting that person's wishes, but also kind of considering some of these other options. Do people talk about that? Or
yeah, and I think, in some states, some options aren't available yet, so that kind of helps.
that limits your choices.
Yeah, so that's helpful. But I think for me, the most important thing and the lesson in my book for me, after the year of exploring, was that the most important thing we can do about death is to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So part of in my book, I have all these, I go on all these adventures, and you reveal all these options through the research. But what so many people have told me, they remember the conversations with my younger daughter, who sort of acted like a foil in the book. I would talk about an option, and she would be like, "Oh, I don't want your body to body farm," or the Warren Wilson Cemetery. She said, "Why wouldn't you just put your body somewhere where we can go visit, and it's so close to home?" So So to me, I think talking about like what is available and talking about with the people that you love, that's a start, and it's a really important one. The other thing I would say, and this relates more to after somebody has died, there's all these different, there's a lot of choices we've talked about today, but sometimes it can be as simple as, you're in the VA hospital, for example, and your dad has just died. You don't have to say goodbye right that second. You have the power to say, no, we're going to spend a little bit of time with with your dad or whoever it is. So because I think our tendency in this culture, we've been trained to, okay, somebody dies, it's the body's gone. And just taking that agency back on ourselves, that can be like a really powerful choice unto itself.
Yeah, because that's like with the shovel. I mean, that moment's not coming back again. That's
Right.
That's your moment. How has your faith, is that, how has you reflected on your own faith as you've heard other people's stories, or you've wrestled with these things yourself, or heard other people's stories about how that lens affects some of the choices they've made or thought about?
Yeah, I was doing the research like really during, I did most of the field work and visiting and volunteering and all right before COVID. And then I was doing most of the writing with two teenagers at home and I was working and teaching. And I didn't really have that much time to reflect on how is my faith. I was like just trying to deal with the realities in front of me of life, like we all were doing and still are during COVID. But what was strengthened for me was this presence, of God in these conversations. Even if the other person wasn't calling it God, I felt this connection with whoever I was talking with. And I actually, a lot of people ask me, isn't it hard to get people to talk about death? And I found the opposite, that when given the space, people entered right in. And that's where, for me, God was present, was in that, between the speaking and the listening about death and life.
Let me ask you one other question, just thinking about that. You end your book with this letter that you write to your children, about your wishes. But that's not chiseled in stone. I mean, that's a living document, right? And I also, whether it seems to me that going through that exercise, that seems like, and it feels like a spiritual exercise, even if someone doesn't name it like that.
Oh, completely. Yes. And I think the whole experience was a religious experience for me, mainly in the encounters with other people. But you hit I would say hit the nail on that. That's kind of a bad metaphor in the church. During Lent, I thought that final wishes were final.
Right. Yes.
And
right.
They're not.
Yeah.
When I went back to read my wishes, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't even remember this person really. And final wishes are something we should revisit at least every 5 years, just to, oh, what did I say? Oh, wow, here's a new thing, that's a new option that's available, or, like I would have loved a home funeral, and the age my children are right now, they're like, no, we don't want your body in the house. You can do a great burial, but like, and that was
chapters of life where things change based on the chapter of life you're in.
Yeah. And there was one of my mentors through this process was like, your kids are young. I mean, 24 and 17, they don't want to think about their mom's death. I mean, as annoying as I am, it's not really where they want to go. But two, they're growing up, and they're, what I ended the book with was wanting to be buried at Warren Wilson Cemetery, but things, it's a living document, as you say.
Great.
All right. So The good news is we didn't get the first little bit due to this crazy Zoom thing. But the good news is this isn't the last you get to hear from Mallory. For the past several weeks, since Lent began, we have been offering a class here at Palmer called The Spirituality of Death. And we have been doing that on Thursday evenings. We begin at 6:30 with soup and salad and bread and or something like that. And we eat together for 30 minutes. And then at 7, we join together. It's a hybrid class. So folks are able to join by Zoom or they're able to attend. And we've been talking about just these issues. We've been talking about death. We started out, Liz Parker did a wonderful job of just sort of talking about Christians and death, just sort of that basic sort of conversation. Last week, we had a lawyer come in and talk about wills and wishes, and that conversation was recorded. And so I can make that available to whoever is interested. Tomorrow evening, we have a conversation with the Funeral Guild here at Palmer. So members of the lay people here at Palmer who do that, as well as the Neville Society, which is another part of our, I guess, plan giving. Yeah, I was trying to think of the right word. So they're going to come tomorrow and do some talking. And the wonderful gift is that we have Mallory joining us next Thursday, a week from tomorrow. And so, again, some of these particular questions, specific questions, we've already let the class know we're going to be really talking about the body and hearing more about that. And that'll be a Zoom setup. So we'll be able to have those conversations like this, but on the screen and in person. So that will happen as well. And then the final one after that will be with a chaplain who is at the medical center, Sarah, and she will be with us to talk about dying well. That's kind of the way we're going to close this out. And this is a class that we are going to offer on a more regular basis. People have just loved this, I think. The numbers have been very strong. Just so we have close to 50 people we've had close to 50 people each week, 20, 25 in the room and the same number on the screen. So that's been remarkable. So folks can join tomorrow, even if you haven't participated before. And Mallory, just on a kind of closing note, thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing, or I guess as somebody who's interested in grief and navigating grief, how you have engaged that and made that sort of engaging a holy and beautiful thing, and not scary. And if it is scary, it's okay to navigate that and talk about it. And so I think that is a beautiful gift. And just to know where you're sitting right now is such a gift to me. I love those mountains and I love that spot. And so I hope to see you at some point soon. But thank you for being here tonight. And this was a recorded conversation. So I'm hopeful that if folks want to see this or share this, we'll make it available. Mallory, thank you. And let's do a run through before next Thursday, and we'll work that detail out. So I hope everybody has a great evening. Oh, let me say one more thing. There were some folks watching this as groups. There are a couple of houses that invited folks to join. And so which is another way we are doing this. Instead of me trying to track down people to do this, if any of you who are watching this would like to host a viewing party for these Great Wednesday webinars, let me know. That's a wonderful way. And what folks do is have maybe a simple meal or coffee and dessert or something together, and they watch the webinar and then spend 30 minutes or so having a conversation about what they learned and some questions they have. So a lot from me. Let me close out and say thank you again, Mallory. Thank you, Neil. And thanks, folks, for being here. Y'all have a great night. Take care. Bye-bye.